Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. This week, we are going to talk about a very human pattern that I think most of us are somewhat familiar with, and it is self-loathing, the tendency to put ourselves down, sometimes with a lot of real feeling and heat. This is a real centipede. It has lots and lots of legs that can be related to our bodies, some particular variations for women, cultural. It can go into undermining and harming ourselves, and can be related to all kinds of early relational traumas and more. So with that fairly brief introduction, here we go.
Thanks, Deb. I think you already lifted up a couple of important things. And I just want to say that I was an advocate for us tackling this topic this week because it is something that I see so much in my practice. It is a real concern for so many people. And if you have persistent feelings of self-loathing, it can really get in the way of functioning. It can make it difficult to socialize. It can make it difficult to tackle new professional projects. And it feels profoundly uncomfortable just to be in your own skin.
Yeah, the anxiety that it can generate can go from sleepless nights to all kinds of self-recriminations for having made the smallest little error in a social interaction, for example, or a work project. The standard that of perfectionism that this can generate, and of course, once that standard is lifted up, there's nothing except failing to meet it since we're not perfect. But it is a very painful place to be inside ourselves.
I think the perfectionism rises out of this hope that if I were only some better version of myself, then either the inner or the outer attackers wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Either they wouldn't say anything, or that I would have some perfect legalistic argument to refute it. And it creates a huge amount of anxiety for people to buy into the idea that if only I were perfect. It really isn't livable, as you said, Deb.
Yeah, it's so very human to say, well, then I'll just do better. I'll be better. I'll get everything right. And of course, it turns into sort of a vicious cycle because that's an unrealistic standard. And then when we slip up, all the more reason to beat ourselves up. And it tends to go not just from, gee, I really goofed on that project, or in some social situation, the narrative tends to go to that I or the person himself or herself is what's bad, that's the problem, not just I made a mistake.
And when it's so pervasive, it's clearly was installed when the person was very young. It can be woven into the bedrock of the personality. I'm thinking of one situation where there was a particularly sadistic superego. And as the story unfolded, this elderly man was raised in a tremendously critical, attacking fundamentalist church. And the laying of sin upon the congregation and demanding that every person come forward to the altar and confess whatever they were accused of or was insinuated became absolutely terrifying. But this authority figure accusing and dragging him forward into this confessional horror is something that would happen in the imagination over and over and over again, and in fact would be enacted in social situations where he would attack himself as part of his social style, which made people very uncomfortable, left him feeling chronically shamed
and overexposed.
And the only beginning movement on it after a long time was being able to link it back to these early formative childhood experiences and the seduction that if one only were to go through that process, receive the condemnation, confess it, sometimes he would lie because there was no way to get out of the altar call, that then there would be this redemptive love that would finally happen. He would finally be made perfect.
Yeah, so that's an example of relentless hope.
Oh, I love that. Absolutely. And it just never happened.
Of course.
And of course, it never worked in his adult life.
And you're bringing this up with this example of this kind of persecutory church experience. But of course, this happens often with parents. Joseph, I like that you use this term, kind of really a harsh superego, which of course is a Freudian formulation. We might see that in Jungian terms as a parental complex, either maybe a very harsh mother or father complex. It would link into early childhood experiences with the parent who perhaps was critical or unloving or withholding or unpredictable. And this gets into attachment issues, which you referenced earlier, Deb. And when we have painful relationship with a parent, there's something that can happen where we both idealize that parent and at the same time internalize the negative voice.
It's a hard concept to kind of understand. So let's unpack that maybe a little bit more. When there are parental expectations or some feeling of a kind of rejection, the child who needs the parent very badly because kids are little and grown-ups are big, has to find a way to create a bond with the parent that covers up the gap in loving care. So then what happens is a child has to create a fantasy bond with that parent. My mom or my dad and other adults, teachers and neighbors and so on, really do love me, so that attachment process that is central in the psyche of a child can take place. So that is the idealization of grown-ups are good, therefore it must be me. I'm the problem. I'm the one that's bad. I'm the one that doesn't measure up. And that gets internalized. So there is this sort of all or nothing split inside us of things are really better than ever in the idealized place, and things are really terrible in the place where that person has learned to blame himself or herself.
I think that is so astute, Deb, that as children, we have to survive and we have to minimize the anxiety and stress of discord around us. So we split, or parts of the psyche split, so that we can apportion different qualities in the inner world. And whether those are idealized qualities, somewhere there's a perfect mom or a perfect dad. And then in the psyche, there's this tremendous, harsh, criticizing, loathing inner figure. And that the ego, the child, has to develop different personalities depending on who they are talking to. And this goes to the Fairbairn idea that when the child thinks they're talking to the exciting withholding parent, the idealized parent, then the child becomes the dutiful, gullible, constantly desperate to please child. And when the child thinks they're talking to the monstrous parent, the ogre parent, then the child brings forward this kind of betraying, angry, seeking the downfall of the ogre kind of person. And then this dynamic gets played out over and over again in object relations later on in life. But long before that, the war's going on inside.
A child cannot afford to turn against the parent. The parent is too badly needed. And so therefore, the child tends to turn against him or herself and construct a narrative, too, that this goes along with Fairbairn, that if there's a problem between me and my parent, it must be my fault. I can become a better girl or a better boy. I'll be more obedient. I'll be tidier. I'll use good table manners. I'm the problem, because it's impossible for kids to think that their parents are the problem. Then they're really living in a kind of random and chaotic world that makes no sense.
And so this process that we've been talking about of interjecting these images of the parent, it's very similar to Jung's idea about how complexes develop. And then, whereas when we were children, perhaps it was our mother telling us that we were fat or a failure or being otherwise incredibly critical, we eventually import that voice into our heads. And sometimes these complexes speak in the actual voice of the parent saying very similar things. Other times it's a little more diffuse than that. The difference between the Fairbairn conceptualization and Jung's conceptualization is that with a Jungian frame, we also understand this content to have an archetypal core. So it touches all the way into the collective unconscious. And for example, this internalized voice of this mother that's constantly castigating us also is associated with the negative pole of the mother complex and is actually functions like a witch in the psyche.
And it can be even more subtle than overt verbal criticism. It may simply be a parent that is somehow neglectful and inattentive.
Yes. And then what we internalize is that somehow we weren't worthy.
Exactly.
We weren't worthy of love.
I think about that frequently, the sadism of not responding.
Oh,
so
yes.
A child comes with the 20th dandelion, to give mom or dad, and, they just won't look up from the newspaper.
Yeah.
And the tremendous sense of confusion and shame and wrongness that the child feels very, very strongly.
And if that happens repeatedly, it does get kind of encoded in a way that we don't always understand where it came from. We just experience it as self-loathing.
I think underneath that, which tends at least to have a fantasy anchor in, body image or not being neat enough or not doing well enough in school, as if that's the reason. But if we go down underneath it, Joseph, your example was so poignant. It's a lot of it is about shame, that somehow at our very core, we are not worthy of parental attention when we bring in, your example, the 20th dandelion, of being mirrored and like, wow, wow, look at how yellow this flower is. For whatever reason, in subtle ways, and in sometimes overtly abusive ways, those are the roots of what Lisa's lifting up as a complex. And because it has an archetypal core, it just underscores how very deep this is.
I'm thinking about a dream that a client brought in kind of a long time ago that speaks to the way the parental interactions can activate this. Really successful older guy, medical profession, like big money, really, had it all. And he came in with a dream. It was actually a recurring dream. And he's in different environments, and he notices that he's lost sensations in his feet. And then he'll look down, and there is a hyena eating or gnawing on one of his feet. And then he'll say something like, "Oh, she does that." And as we've unpacked it, or had unpacked it many, many times, the closest analog that we could find was his earlier childhood experience of never being able to be praised for his academic successes at school. That however he put his foot forward, so to speak, to get that A, to take all AP classes and to do the clubs and make sure that he could get into an amazing school, that it was always met with, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that, which really I think was envy was the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of critical hyena would just always not eat his foot and not break his leg, but make sure that it was always bloody.
So, Joseph, how did that dynamic manifest in his life? In what way were his feet being eaten in his life?
Well, it was a spoiling energy, so that nothing actually felt good, which meant that he was often overspending, that he was constantly pursuing what I would say now is this optimization of every aspect of life. He was on the third wife because he kept looking for the thing that was going to give him a feeling of joy, a feeling that things could be positive. And he manifested the gnawing hyena by looking at every experience and finding it not enough. In the same way that was done to him. So, I just got this great house. And then 8 months later, this, and this isn't right. I just got married 3 years ago, but chomp, 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 chomp. And the chomping was so effective that he had to move out of the house, that it just wouldn't allow him to have anything with a sense of pleasure.
Yeah. So it's the theme of you can't get enough of what you really don't need. But I'm aware that is that dynamic of this man and that seeking dynamic can often be very much a part of this thing of to keep trying, can get instilled or installed early on in life of keep trying. Maybe next time. You had mentioned relentless hope, Elisa, that maybe if I buy another house or have another relationship, another marriage, then it'll work next time.
Yeah.
And it will work because it will escape the gnawing criticism.
But I think the situation that you just described, Joseph, I mean, obviously that's an incredibly poignant clinical example. It sounds like the self-hatred in that sense was a little more diffuse. I'm really aware of working with people who have this, it's a real self-attack that occurs in some cases almost constantly. I mean, I used to work with a young man. He was about 30 years old, and he would sometimes just stop himself in mid-sentence and kind of shake himself. And I would say, what just happened? You weren't even able to finish that idea. And he would say, it was my dad telling me I'm a piece of shit. And he would literally not be able to follow a thought to the end because there would be this incredibly eviscerating inner voice that would attack him. And it made it really hard for him to manage relationships with men, manage relationships with women, made it difficult to get started in a career.
And he heard it literally as a vocal stream
Yes.
inside of his mind. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes that can masquerade in a more subtle way as just self-deprecation.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't appear to be quite so vicious, and maybe we even talk ourselves into thinking that it's our modesty and we don't want to get a swelled head. So, I don't know. Sometimes I do those silly things, or I don't pay any attention to me. That's no big deal. And it has a lighter tone to it, although the taproot goes way down deep into this self-loathing.
Well, and the thing is, if you're self-deprecating, that's also a social strategy to kind of signal that you're not going to be a threat. Yeah. And it can be a way of kind of making yourself a little safer in the world by reducing people's expectations. It can be a way of kind of confronting your own destiny in a way. Also, the self-loathing that is kind of ruminative. Some of this can be understood as rumination. I'm so fat, I'm such a failure. There's a way that kind of rumination is always a defense against deeper underlying feeling. So, for example, it may be easier to ruminate on I'm such a fat failure than to actually feel the deep sorrow and grief at having been failed by our parent.
I think that's true. And it goes to the idea also of the broken wing act.
Yes.
That the psyche can mislead us as a really strange kind of defense. So we'll obsess about our waistline or obsess about some other thing that we can point to very obviously and say, that's the problem, that gosh darn problem. And really underneath it is a different kind of problem that's really more excruciating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we're in the realm of neurotic suffering, right? And what we've talked about repeatedly, but it's such a great quote. Jung said that a neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. So in that case, the rumination about our weight and it's acutely painful, by the way, to ruminate about our weight, for example. It's not that we're taking the easy way out. In some ways, it's incredibly painful, but somehow it's easier to metabolize than dropping into the grief. And that would be the legitimate suffering.
So instead of the legitimate deep grieving and experiencing the pain of that and the hurt of that, it gets hooked onto something else that is more available to consciousness, such as body image or something about performance and competency. And that leads, one again and again, because it's really the false thing, we never get done with it because we haven't really identified the true underlying issue and the true underlying feelings. So we just get caught in this repetitive cycle of, oh, I'm such a goof up. God, I did it again. I'm always goofing things up. And there we are caught in a neurotic trap.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes less benignly than that. I mean, I've had clients who feel that they've made a mistake, or maybe they did. I don't know, they said something they wish they hadn't said, got a speeding ticket or something, and they'll go home and they'll slap themselves in the face, literally slapping themselves in the face, calling themselves stupid. It's often a very shameful confession that will come up deep into the analysis. It often will feel almost like I'm slapped in the face. It's just it feels so shocking. The disclosure and heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it comes to this idea of how do people discharge the self-loathing energy? And I think that's something that we could talk about, because that also prioritizes how it's going to be intervened on. I mean, if somebody's discharging behavior is really, really putting them in danger versus just walking around being quietly self-hating, there's gradations of what people do with this. So we and our clients walk around with this self-attacking language, which creates this atmosphere of self-loathing. And people have to find a way of coping if they can't get to the bottom of it. They have to somehow discharge the tension that rolls up in them. And I found myself thinking about all kinds of behaviors that can be discharging behaviors. People that are constantly attacking their bodies can go through periods of being highly promiscuous in the effort to try to collect evidence that they are desirable. Sometimes people will become astoundingly hiding, quite literally, maybe hiding in the parents' basement and not applying for a college or not getting a job, because to be seen is to be attacked. And
Yes.
hiding creates this maladaptive way of avoiding this attacking behavior. People can also do something called projective identification, where they unconsciously push the critical voice into another person, maybe a boss or a friend, and then they provoke the criticism from the other person.
And this is all unconscious, of course.
This is all unconscious, which gives them a sense of relief. So, I know this is like a total trope, but somebody buys some clothing, it's a little too tight, and you turn to your spouse and you say, "Do these pants make me look fat?" And that's like a loaded gun. So it's really an invitation to move the fat shaming comment into the spouse, and God help the husband or wife who says, it does make you a little too round back there. And then all of a sudden, it can release all of this defensive anger. But we actually really pulled the criticism out of the other person and then really want to go to town and blame them for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all the medicating stuff. When our self-hating voices are really loud, we may one day discover that if I just drink a six-pack, it seems to be quiet.
Absolutely. I have a feeling that this dynamic of self-loathing underpins a lot of substance abuse stuff.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, the self-loathing is kind of a defense against some deeper feeling. And then the self-loathing itself has to be managed with something like substances. Another thing that's like that too is binging and purging. I've worked with some people who binge, and it's interesting to hear about that experience, which I think most of us actually can relate to in our own experience, even if we don't have a disorder. Most people can relate to what it's like to binge. The quality of it is that while you're consuming that thing, everything else gets blocked out for that period of time. During the binge, it's the only thing you think about. That those self-attacking voices are gone for while you're eating that plate of brownies. And of course, as soon as you're done, they come back in full force.
Yeah. So it's a palliative, an escape hatch, but only for a little while.
Right.
And then it creates the very thing even stronger of, oh God, I can't believe I ate all those brownies.
Yeah.
Oh God, I am a fat pig.
Yeah. And that's why one of the ways, and we will talk about this more in a few minutes, but one of the ways to interrupt that cycle is to approach yourself with compassion at that moment rather than continuing the attack. Because otherwise, there's a spiral effect there. You do the behavior and it for a little bit helps, but then you feel worse. And then you do the behavior some more. You're sort of off to the races at that point. And so some of the very practical matter here is how do you unwind that spiral? I'm thinking though other ways that this gets managed is just depression. We just find ourselves getting depressed because of these self-attacking voices.
And depression is that lockup. For instance, some part of us does want to step out and have a good experience at work or in our social lives. The critical voice sets up kind of an artificial dam inside of us. And when life force backs up and backs up and backs up, we can go into a depression.
Yeah, and it can feed that avoidance that you were talking about earlier, Joseph, where we just don't step out.
So I wonder if I kind of add all this up from just self-deprecating kind of stuff to something as truly self-destructive as the things you've just mentioned. It seems like what we're saying is that self-loathing or lack of self-compassion and basic self-esteem is underneath an awful lot of stuff. Not feeling worthy of
Yeah.
being treated lovingly, responsibly, compassionately, sensibly, that if we really of truly caring for ourselves.
Yeah. I wonder if I can just give a brief clinical example. Worked with a young woman about 28 years old. She had a very difficult relationship with her mother. And that wound up meaning that she had a very harsh, incredibly persistent self-critical voice into adulthood that made all kinds of things difficult for her. And she had an incredibly important dream at one point that featured her mother, and they were having a confrontation in the dream, sitting next to one another. And all of a sudden, the dream mother grew incredibly menacing and grabbed the woman's arm and just took a big, gruesome, grisly bite out of her flesh in the dream. So it was such a striking image of how a content like this behaves in the psyche. And it's an image of a complex that is attacking the ego that has too much power. So part of the answer here is the ego has to find the strength to confront this damaging complex. Which brings me to a really brief fairy tale example of this. There is a type of fairy tale called the false bride and the true bride, and there are many, many different versions of this fairy tale. One of the most famous ones is probably the Grimm's tale known as the Goose Girl. And in it, a princess is on her way to be wed to the neighboring king or something. And she has a maid to go with her. And the mother has given her daughter the protections and left specific instructions to the maid. But once they kind of get on the road, the princess says, I'm thirsty. Would you get me some water? And the maid says, get off your horse and get your own water. And the princess is just absolutely powerless to confront this voice, or to confront her maid, as it were, before I begin to psychologize it. And so she does as her maid bids. And before long, by the time they get to the king's abode, they've changed places, and the princess is now wearing the maid's clothing and vice versa. And the maid presents herself as the princess, and the princess actually has to serve as the goose girl until the situation is remedied by the end of the tale. But to me, this is an image of a complex that is attacking, that has usurped the ego, that is grinding the ego underfoot, making functioning difficult, and is really kind of running the show. And when we have intense self-loathing, it really is like this negative complex is running the show.
What this makes me think of, Lisa, is what a big help it is simply to be able to name it as a complex. Aha! That kind of breaks the charm right there of it's not just me. Something's wrong with me that I can't control my behavior, or why am I doing this? It's there is a word and a term for it. And how do we get complexes? Well, we get them from our past, as we have already said, and we also can get them from our culture. Oh my gosh. So I will go on my one of my habitual but very brief rants about how incredibly unrealistic our culture is just on this one topic of what women should look like, of how our bodies should be, how we should dress, makeup and being attractive and slim hipped and all the rest of it. And it's bonkers. Nobody can meet these unrealistic images for body type and appearance and hairstyling and all the rest of it. So, whether it is in one's personal upbringing, family of origin, culture, were you the right height or the wrong height? Were you the same sort of cultural background? Are there racial differences, religious differences? All of these things from the external world can get lodged in us as complexes. And if we can know that, it gives us a little bit of a handhold to say, hey, wait a minute, here's something now that I can start to confront.
Well, the culture can give us the complex, and I also think that if we have such a complex that's developing in the psyche because of developmental reasons, it may be that the self-loathing lands in these particular places because of cultural attitudes.
Yes.
So for women, it is often around appearance and in specifics, weight and body image. And I imagine it might be different for men.
Yeah. And after childbirth, a woman is expected to be back in yoga class in her leotard looking great within a couple of weeks. Some of this is really, these are impossible standards, and give this self-loathing complex, as you said, Lisa, a place to land.
So what are some of the additional ways that we grapple with this? One that you were bringing up, Deb, which is central to Jungian work, is to disidentify with this object in the psyche.
Yes.
That I'm over here and I have a critical voice.
Yes.
That's marauding around, in my garage, and that I can have it and interact with it and distance from it, create some objectivity.
This was one of Jung's central insights, that if you personify a psychic content, you can have a different relationship with it, because you can have a conversation with it. You can recognize that it's not your ego. And so it helps develop this kind of reflective capacity. And this is what's so wonderful about Jungian work, is that we can have this rich source of imagery that we can use to personify these psychic contents and see them as really rich entities, almost with lives of their own in our psyche. So we can see that inner voice marauding around our psyche as a witch. And you know something? The thing about witches is that they usually have a treasure. So if you can overcome the witch in a fairy tale, you'll often find that she's got a whole back room that's filled with gold and jewels.
So it's a process first of differentiating, starting with naming it as a complex. So already now it's somewhat separate, even if it's just an idea in your head. And then you can kind of let it percolate down by personifying it. So you might, draw it or sculpt something, give it a name, and then using our active imagination, let it talk to you. And I mean talk out loud. as one possibility of dealing with this, of when you're alone in, let's say, a living room, you can sit in one chair. This is a well-known Gestalt technique, and have your complex sit in the other chair and move back and forth and say out loud all the things you want to say to that complex, and then move over to the other chair and let the complex say everything that is on his or her mind. Of putting it in words and with feeling in an enacted way is one possibility.
From a more introverted standpoint, something that I will ask clients to do is to relax for a minute or two silently, to imagine that they're in a dark room. They're standing at the door, but the negative voice is somewhere in the dark room and they can hear it. I ask them to imagine a pool of light that is tightly around them and to invite the figure to stand in the light. If they're relaxed enough, often an image will constellate. And then there's an important dance of how to relate to the image. Almost always, I think of this as a cursed figure, like a fairy tale. The beast needs to be loved by Belle. Something's required which the ego is resistant to.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that this monstrous being has to be embraced. Maybe it has to be kissed in order for these curses to fall out of its mouth, for it to suddenly transform in some fashion. In a more dramatic way, often as I'm working with military, active duty, or veterans, there is sometimes war trauma that will haunt them, that they have had to participate in something that involved a loss of life. It's not uncommon for men to then be haunted in a very attacking way around this. In situations like that, I'll encourage a more shamanic attitude, where when they feel strong enough and they can understand the difference clearly between the imaginal level of things and the literal level, which has to be established first, in session, we'll go into a deep relaxation. And then as the accuser comes forward, to allow the accuser to do whatever it wants to do, to discharge its tension. And maybe it's going to attack the inner figure. It's going to do something, say things. It might feel that it does life-threatening behavior in the imaginal world. And for the military person to withstand that in a relaxed, poised, calm, strong way. And this often happens with shamans. Their power animals will bite off a limb or gobble them up or throw them into a great cavern. And if all of these things are understood as symbolic and not able to hurt you physically, they can be easily tolerated. And when the inner figure has discharged its tension, often it returns to the ego in a different form, and often as an ally.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that this is sort of the secret, is that these incredibly powerful energies in the unconscious that seem to block us and persecute us can be turned into allies with the right attitude and the right approach. And that's a really beautiful example, Joseph. I think approaching these energies with a certain amount of curiosity, agreeing to engage them, really having a confrontation with them in the sense of kind of standing forehead to forehead with these contents, creates a vessel in which these energies can be transformed, often in surprising ways.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
A last thing that I'd like to offer is to not resist this. You know, there's a wonderful gospel passage, Matthew 5:39. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, But whoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn and offer him also the left. I don't know that that works in the social sphere so well, but sometimes
Psychologically.
it can work in the inner planes, in the inner worlds. So about once a year, I will have this strange visitation with this critical chorus. Sometimes it might keep me up all night long. This litany of everything I've done wrong from early childhood onward. And I used to fuss and resist and fight. And finally, I became wiser, and I would listen carefully, and I would find the truth in what was being said on some level. And I would simply say, yes, I did that. And that would be my only answer. Yes, I did that. Over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
There is in Kabbalah a choir of angels that are called the Aralim. And it's said that they come to us and they confront us, but their confrontation is in service to discovering the meaning of our suffering. And only after I say, yes, I did that, this is true, can I then ask the question of the meaning behind it. When I keep refuting something, I never get to the point of meaning.
I think that is an incredibly important point. So I'm just going to go back and kind of underline it, of that we get to the meaning
Mm-hmm.
instead of just going around and around in a perpetual circle of self-criticism. What is it about?
Right.
And I also like the, and I did that,
Mm.
of accepting shadow. Yes,
Yep.
I did that. That is part of my shadow. I ate the plate of brownies. I took part in a military exercise where people got killed. I did do those things. I did. Of being able to accept shadow, which goes back to what you were saying, Lisa, about the witch. And that's also where the treasure is, in that back room.
Yeah.
It is ever thus.
And it is the path of peace. Often the next morning I feel tired, but I also feel clean and relaxed.
Yeah. So it's a kind of ablution or something, or
it's a purifying fire. Yeah.
You know, I think I have a slightly different way of working with my own inner negative attacking voices that I don't think any of us don't have. And it's something that
it's true
that I'll share is that what I find is that sometimes these voices visit us, and we actually don't sometimes know this, but we have a choice about whether or not to engage these voices. So the little voice comes along and says, "Oh man, you really effed that up." And you can either kind of go on that ride and continue thinking about how badly you effed something up, or you can just sort of let it go by. And the image that I'll often use for this is I'll say to someone, let's say that you're walking along the street, a nice sunny day, and some guy pulls up in a beat up old car, rolls down the window, and commands you to get in the car. And when you look in, he's got his baseball cap on backwards, and he's got a baseball bat sitting next to him on the seat. Do you get in the car? Don't get in the car. That guy's just going to beat you up if you get in the car. Don't get in the car. And what I mean practically by that is you can, especially when we're feeling low, if we're depressed, if we're tired, if we've gone through something difficult, and we have a negative thought visit us like, oh man, I'm such an idiot. If you kind of get in the car, if you go on that ride, you're going to tell yourself all kinds of stories about how big an idiot you are. And the next thing you know, you're going to be making decisions about what you're going to do in the next day or two based on what a big idiot you are. You may decide, I'm not going to go to that dinner party because I'm such an idiot. I'm just going to make a fool of myself. And you will have spun a whole narrative around this one idea that visited you, that you're an idiot. And so sometimes when that happens to me and I think, oh, I'm such an idiot, I'll just kind of think, oh, there it is. There's that thought. And I'll just kind of let it go. And if there is something for me to learn from maybe some way that I did make a mistake, I'll be able to deal with that later. I'm not necessarily avoiding a confrontation with a mistake, but I don't want to get too invested in thinking about it if I'm feeling a little low and vulnerable, because I'm not going to be making good decisions at that point.
I'm thinking about a way to embrace one's inner idiot, and I think we all have one. And this was an exercise in a group training that is called the Village Idiot. And in this exercise, everyone in the group is to behave like the quintessential village idiot, whatever that person's idea is. So can you imagine a whole group of people mingling around and kind of slurring words and pawing one another and stumbling over the furniture? And here's what happens. Everyone, after maybe 5 minutes of this, starts to roar with laughter. It's another example of going where the negative voice is. Go there and engage it. And maybe you have it out with it. Maybe you own it the way Joseph did. Maybe you can start to laugh.
Mm-hmm.
But one way or another, go there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good place to switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work, but producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
This week's dream comes from a woman who is 36 years old, and she is a PhD student in clinical psychology. And here's the dream. I found a tiny fish in the sink. It was really beat up, but alive, so I got a bowl of water for it and put it there, but it immediately started outgrowing the bowl. I got a bigger bowl, but as soon as I put it there, the fish got bigger. I got a tub of water and put it there, and it got even bigger. It had stripes, and it was looking at me and interacting with me the whole time. The fish seemed to have a soul. And she says, I had this dream as I'm getting more and more involved in my Jungian analysis and my PhD program. And she says, the feelings in the dream, at first I felt uncertain if I should discard the fish or bother with it. But as I started taking care of it and it started responding, I became more invested.
Okay, so we're all sitting here smiling. And you know what? This is a real literalization, and yet it's such a great image. I have to put it out there. Of with koi, that's what you do. The more room you give them, the bigger they get.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they're little, if you keep them in a much smaller surround, they don't grow.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so she's wound up with a fantastic, large, healthy, vibrant koi. And the people collect them because they're so beautiful.
So, and I just want to say that I think that this is actually a good image for what can happen when we work with our dreams. Is that at first, if we haven't been paying attention to our dreams, maybe we just have a little bitty bit of a dream. But if we tend to it and we pick it up and we water it and pay attention to it and write it down and maybe talk about it in analysis, we'll find that the next week we'll remember more of our dreams. And as we continue to do this, oftentimes the dreams will become more and more vivid and expressive and plentiful. So the face that we turn toward the unconscious matters a great deal. And the unconscious will respond in kind.
Yeah. I'm also very much, I'm back on the image of the fish. And fish are in the ocean. They are the contents of the great unconscious of, back millennia ago when people went fishing, who knew where they came from? And so I'm thinking of this as you were saying, Lisa, it's related to dreams of a content of the unconscious, the life of the unconscious, just as fish in the ocean are the life of the great unconscious.
What's in the unconscious often has an archetypal significance.
Yes.
And this dream made me think of a story from the Puranas called, sometimes known as Manu and the Talking Fish. And Manu was a sage, or in some versions of the story, I think he was the ruler, and he lives on the banks of a river. And one morning he goes down to the river and he dips out a little bit of water and he finds a tiny fish in the water. So he brings it home and he puts it in a bowl. And the next day he finds that the fish is bigger. So he transfers it to a larger container. The next day the fish had grown too big for that. So then he put it in a tank behind his cottage. And then the tank was too small. So finally he carries it back to the sea and he says, "You're strong enough to take care of yourself and may God go with you." And the fish says to him, "I will remember your kindness, and if you ever need help, I'll be there for you." And the fish swims away. And then there is kind of the Hindu equivalent of the Noah story, where it begins to rain and rain and rain. And Manu is the one who builds a ship and fills it with stores and has other people on board. And when he's trying to navigate the dangerous waters of this ocean that now covers the world, the talking fish shows up and leads him to safety. And it turns out that the talking fish is none other than the Lord Vishnu.
Wow, this dream really has those fairy tale elements in it, doesn't it? Taking care of a fish. There are so many talking fish stories and fairy tales that, taking care of the content of the unconscious leads to good things. Sometimes treasure, sometimes the unconscious comes to the rescue of the ego.
And fish is a Christ symbol, too.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's a symbol of the self.
Fish are also an ancient symbol of fertility and sexuality, because fish can produce so many eggs and hundreds and thousands of offspring that they were associated with being fecund and fertile. And in the ancient world, something few of us experience in the modern world, the oceans were teeming with fish, just enormous communities of churning, roiling life in the oceans and the lakes. And to ancient peoples, that must have seemed just extraordinary.
Yeah.
So when I think about finding the tiny fish in the sink that's really beat up, I would also venture just an inquiry with the dreamer. What is your history around sexuality and your sense of yourself as a sexual being as part of the analysis, or just instigated by the self? Is your own fertile sexuality becoming more aware to you and something that you're interested in caring for? And as she says in the dream, it's alive, so I got it a bowl of water. So it may have been something that at one time she thought was dead, and then discovered, well, lo and behold, there's a little bit of life in here. It's a little bit. As she takes on the task of finding it a bowl of water, the fish begins to make requirements, make demands upon her subtly. Once she's laid claim to it, it gets bigger. It needs a little more, needs a little room. So it's an interesting ambivalence that I think we often have. And Jung wrote about this, that we discover something in the psyche, and then the psyche requires something of us. We are then responsible for it. Jung also talked about this in terms of the creative spirit. He was an extraordinarily prolifically creative person, and sometimes lamented it, that his creative daimon just constantly would not let him rest, but he was ever in service to bringing forward what's required through him. The fish also seems to be requiring something from her, which is an ever larger environment with which to swim and interact. And we might even imagine at some point the fish will have to be released into an ocean or a lake or a river, that the artificial environment won't be enough any longer. And that may also be a metaphor for herself, that she is outgrowing or beginning to outgrow various attitudes that have been fish bowls, or various situations that are kind of fish bowls. When I look at just the image of the fish bowl, I think about the performative aspects of being a person in the world. That to be in a fish bowl is often a metaphor for often how master classes are conducted or classes are conducted, where you're in a kind of isolated stage and other people are watching you. So I'm wondering if she's going to outgrow a certain kind of performative attitude or performative aspect of her life and move into something that's more dangerous, like living in a lake, but also much more exciting and infinitely varied.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that's really resonates with me, Joseph. I think it's right on. And she says that she had the dream as she's getting more and more involved in her Jungian analysis and PhD program. So that, that seems to parallel of I'm getting bigger.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's great. I did have a little chuckle because there is a trope that if you see a Jungian analyst, you will begin having Jungian dreams. Perhaps that's true.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.